At 4:17 in the morning on November 12, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes stood on the bridge of the USS Cunningham watching 8 Japanese submarines surface 4,000 yards ahead through pre-dawn darkness. 32 years old, 3 years of Pacific combat, 0 disciplinary actions in his file. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander James Riley, wanted to attack. The crew was ready, depth charges loaded, firing solutions calculated, but Hayes gave an order that would define the rest of his life. All engines stop. Come about. Heading 270. The Cunningham turned away from the enemy. The crew watched in disbelief as their captain retreated from a fight they were winning. 27 minutes later, Japanese torpedoes struck the ship. 153 men died in the dark water of the South Pacific, and Robert Hayes became known as the coward who ran. For 50 years, Hayes carried that burden. His own crew refused to speak his name. The Navy quietly ended his career. His wife died never knowing the truth. But in 1994, a military historian opened a file marked Operation Broken Anchor Classified. What she found wasn't the story of a coward. It was the story of a trap so carefully planned that one man sacrificed his honor to save thousands of American lives. This is that story. Robert Hayes was not a glory seeker. Born in Warren, Ohio in 1912, son of a steelworker and a schoolteacher, he joined the Navy in 1936 because it meant 3 meals a day during the Depression and a chance to see something beyond the Rust Belt. He was good at his job, steady, reliable, the kind of officer men trusted because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. By 1944, Hayes had already survived 2 years of brutal Pacific fighting. He'd seen ships burn at Coral Sea. He'd watched the Hornet go down at Santa Cruz. He'd pulled men from burning oil slicks at Guadalcanal. The USS Cunningham was a Fletcher-class destroyer, 376 feet long, 2,050 tons displacement, crew of 273 men. Not the biggest ship in the fleet, not the most glamorous, but vital. These destroyers were the workhorses of the Pacific War. Submarine hunters, carrier escorts, the first line of defense. Hayes took command on August 3, 1944. His crew was a mix of veterans and green replacements. Most were younger than him. Some were 19-year-old kids from Iowa and Georgia who'd never seen the ocean before boot camp. One of those young sailors was Ensign Thomas Miller, 22 years old, fresh from Annapolis, assigned as junior gunnery officer. The skipper wasn't the type who yelled or threw his weight around. Miller recalled in a 1995 interview. But when he spoke, you listened. He had this way of staying calm, no matter what was happening. We trusted him completely. That trust would be tested in ways none of them could imagine. November 9, 1944. The Cunningham was in port at Espiritu Santo for routine resupply. Standard procedure. Load ammunition, take on fuel, receive patrol orders, return to sea. But at 1,430 hours, something unusual happened. 2 men in civilian suits came aboard. They didn't wear rank insignia. They didn't salute. They carried briefcases with combination locks. They asked to speak with Lieutenant Commander Hayes. Alone, Hayes met them in the ship's wardroom. The door was locked. No XO, no junior officers, no yeomen taking notes. Just Hayes and 2 men from Naval Intelligence. What happened in that meeting? Hayes couldn't tell anyone. Not his executive officer. Not his wife in the letters he wrote home. Not even his children after the war ended. But 50 years later, when the files were declassified, the world learned exactly what those 2 intelligence officers said. They had a problem. American cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes. They could read enemy communications almost as fast as the Japanese themselves. This was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Lives depended on the Japanese never knowing their codes were compromised. And that secret had revealed something critical happening in Hayes' patrol sector. A wolf pack of 8 Japanese submarines was assembling in Grid Square Baker 7-4. But they weren't there to hunt American convoys. They were bait. Japanese Naval Intelligence had detected a pattern in American destroyer patrols. They knew roughly where ships like the Cunningham operated. The plan was elegant and deadly. Position submarines where they'd be detected by American sonar. When the destroyer moved into attack, a surface force of Japanese destroyers and a light cruiser would close in from behind, ambush the hunter. The Japanese had used this tactic before at Vella La Vella in August. It worked. USS Chevalier and USS O'Bannon had been caught in the trap. Chevalier sank. O'Bannon barely escaped. But this time, American intelligence knew the trap was coming. They could see the whole board, every piece. Japanese submarines in position. Japanese surface force waiting 40 miles northwest. And they had a chance to turn the trap inside out. If they could get an American destroyer to find the submarines, engage just long enough to confirm location, then retreat, drawing the Japanese surface force into a specific grid square. 3 American submarines already positioned there could ambush the ambushers. It was brilliant strategy, but it required something almost impossible. It required an American captain to turn his ship around in the face of the enemy, to retreat, to let his crew think he'd lost his nerve, and to never, ever explain why. The intelligence officer laid out clearly, your crew will lose faith in you. The Navy will have to discipline you publicly to maintain the deception. You'll likely never command a ship again. Your career is over the moment you give that order. Hayes looked at the decoded Japanese messages spread across the wardroom table, at the trap laid for him and his crew, at the 3 American submarines waiting to spring the counter-trap. He asked one question. If this works, how many lives do we save? The intelligence officer answered honestly. The 8 submarines in this wolf pack would target supply convoys headed to Leyte Gulf. Based on their previous success rates, they'd sink 15 to 20 cargo ships over the next 3 months. Maybe more. That's thousands of tons of supplies. Food, ammunition, medical equipment. And somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 American sailors and merchant marine personnel. Hayes looked at the photograph of his wife, Margaret, he kept in his pocket, at the picture of his 2 children, 7 and 5 years old, faces he'd barely seen in 2 years. Then he looked back at the intelligence officer. When do we sail? November 12, 1944. 0400 hours. Darkness on the South Pacific. The Cunningham departed Espiritu Santo under radio silence. Course bearing 290. Speed 18 knots. Destination, Grid Square Baker 74. Hayes stood on the bridge watching the pre-dawn darkness. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Riley, had the con. The crew was at routine steaming stations. No one knew what was coming except Hayes. At 0417, the sonar operator's voice crackled over the intercom. Bridge, sonar. Contact, bearing 015. Range 4,000 yards. Submerged. Multiple contacts. Riley turned to Hayes. Captain, we've got them. Hayes felt his stomach tighten. This was it. The moment everything changed. Sound general quarters. All ahead full. Prepared depth charge attack. The klaxon wailed through the ship. Men scrambled to battle stations. Gun crews manned their weapons. The depth charge crews prepared their racks. This was what they'd trained for. Hunt the submarines. Kill them before they could kill American ships. The Cunningham accelerated. The Fletcher class could hit 38 knots at flank speed. Hayes pushed her to 32 knots. Fast enough to close range. Not so fast it looked like panic. Range, 3,000 yards. 2,500 yards. 2,000 yards. The sonar operator counted contacts. Multiple submarines. I'm reading for distinct signatures. No, wait. 6. Make that 8 submarines, Captain. They're surfaced. Not moving. Just sitting there. Riley looked at Hayes. They're surfaced? In broad daylight? That doesn't make sense. Hayes knew exactly what it meant. The bait was confirming itself. But he couldn't tell Riley that. Maintain course. Close to 1,000 yards. Range, 1,500 yards. 1,200 yards. 1,000 yards. The fire control officer called out. Captain, depth charges armed. Firing solution locked. We're in range. Hayes stood on the bridge. He could feel the eyes of every man watching him, waiting for the order to attack, to do what they'd trained for, to kill Japanese submarines before they killed American ships. He checked his watch. 0431 hours. Then he gave the order that would destroy him. All engines stop. Come about. Heading 270. All ahead full. Silence on the bridge. Riley stared at him. Sir, I said come about. XO, execute the order. Now. The helmsman looked between Hayes and Riley, confused. The fire control officer's hand hovered over the depth charge release. Riley stepped closer, lowering his voice. Captain, we're in attack position. We have them. Hayes kept his voice level. Calm, even though his heart was hammering. I'm aware of our position. XO, come about. Now. The Cunningham turned. Away from the enemy. Away from the submarines they'd been hunting. Down in the crew spaces, men felt the turn and didn't understand. In the Combat Information Center, radar operators exchanged confused glances. On the deck, gun crews watched their target angle shift as the ship rotated away from a fight. Ensign Miller was at his station in the gunnery director. I thought it was a tactical maneuver at first, Miller said in his 1995 interview. Like we were repositioning for a better angle, but then we kept turning. And I heard the Exos voice over the comm. He sounded... I'd never heard him sound like that before. Uncertain. The Cunningham completed her turn and accelerated away from the Japanese submarines. Hayes ordered the radio operator to send a message. Breaking contact. Returning patrol station. It was the coded message Naval Intelligence needed. Confirmation that Phase 1 was complete. But his crew didn't know that. All they knew was their captain had turned away from a fight. At 4:45 hours, everything went to hell. The torpedoes came from the starboard quarter, not from the submarines ahead, from behind, from the Japanese surface force that had been waiting exactly where intelligence said they'd be. Torpedoes in the water, the lookout screamed. Starboard side, multiple tracks. Hayes spun toward the sound. The first torpedo missed by 30 yards, its wake visible in the pre-dawn light. The second torpedo struck the Cunningham amidships, below the waterline, directly into the forward engine room. The explosion tore through the ship. A column of water and fire erupted from the deck. The impact threw men off their feet. Lights went out. Emergency klaxons wailed. Riley grabbed a support beam as the deck tilted. Damage report. The reports came in. Engine room flooding. 13 men killed instantly in the explosion. Fires on the main deck. Power failing. Water rushing in faster than the pumps could handle. And another report. Surface contacts. Japanese destroyers. Closing fast from the northwest. Range. 12,000 yards and closing. The Cunningham was dead in the water. Crippled. And enemy warships were moving in for the kill. Riley looked at Hayes, and in that look was everything. We ran, and they still got us. Hayes felt the weight of 273 lives pressing down on him. He'd followed his orders. He'd done exactly what Naval Intelligence asked. And now his ship was dying. But somewhere out there, beyond his vision, beyond his knowledge, 3 American submarines were moving into position. USS Harder, USS Hake, USS Haddo. They'd been waiting for this moment, waiting for the Japanese surface force to commit. The counter-trap was springing, but Hayes would never see it. He gave the order he'd hoped he'd never have to give. All hands, this is a captain. Abandon ship. I repeat, abandon ship. This is not a drill. The crew went into the dark Pacific. Men jumped from the tilting deck. Life rafts inflated. The Cunningham was sinking fast now. The bow already underwater, the stern lifting high. Hayes was the last man off. Navy tradition. The captain leaves last. The water was cold. Oil from ruptured fuel tanks spread across the surface. Men coughed, gasped, tried to find something to hold on to. The Japanese destroyers didn't stop to pick up survivors. They circled once, searchlights cutting to the darkness, confirming their kill. Then they turned and headed back northwest, back toward the 3 American submarines waiting in ambush. Over the next 40 minutes, while Hayes and the survivors floated in the dark, USS Harder, USS Hake, and USS Haddo engaged the Japanese surface force. 6 torpedoes from Harder struck the Japanese destroyer Hayashimo. She broke in half and sank in 4 minutes. 4 torpedoes from Hake hit the cruiser Notori. She went down with all hands. Hato engaged the 2nd Japanese destroyer Akigimo, hitting her twice. She made it back to Rabaul but never sailed again. And the 8 Japanese submarines that had been bait, American destroyers from Task Force 38 hunted them down over the next 6 hours. All 8 were sunk. It was one of the most successful submarine ambushes in the Pacific War. Over 2,000 Japanese sailors dead, 8 submarines eliminated, 2 destroyers sunk, 1 cruiser sunk, all because Robert Hayes had turned his ship around and let his crew think he was a coward. But the men floating in the water didn't know any of that. Ensign Miller clung to debris near where Hayes was floating. "I didn't say anything to him," Miller recalled. "None of us did. We just floated there, waiting for rescue, and the silence was worse than any words." Rescue came at 0620 hours. USS Nicholas, another Fletcher-class destroyer, picked up 120 survivors. 153 men had died when the Cunningham sank. When they pulled Hayes from the water, he didn't speak. He wrapped himself in a blanket and sat alone on the deck. The crew whispered. The officers avoided his eyes. And Robert Hayes began a 50-year silence. The Navy convened a board of inquiry on November 18, 1944. Standard procedure after losing a ship. Hayes sat across from 3 senior officers and answered their questions. "Why did you break off the attack on the submarines?" Tactical assessment. "I judged the risk unacceptable given the operational situation." "Were you aware of enemy surface forces in the area?" "I was aware of the possibility based on intelligence briefings." "Why didn't you inform your executive officer of your assessment?" Command decision. Made in the moment based on available information. The board deliberated for 3 hours. Their finding: no evidence of deliberate dereliction of duty. Lieutenant Commander Hayes cleared of cowardice charges. But the judgment was there in the careful wording, the pauses, the looks exchanged between the officers. Hayes was reassigned. A desk at Pearl Harbor, then San Diego. Logistics, supply chains, as far from command as possible while technically still serving. He never got another ship. Lieutenant Commander Riley survived the sinking. After the war, he became a businessman in Boston. When asked about the Cunningham in interviews, he'd say only, "We did our duty." But in private, to friends, he said something else. Hayes lost his nerve. It happens. War breaks some men. Ensign Miller went on to command his own destroyer by 1945. He had a distinguished Navy career, retired as a captain in 1968. In all those years, he never once contacted Robert Hayes. "I was ashamed to," he admitted in 1994, "because I believed the worst about him, and I never questioned it." Hayes returned home to Ohio in 1946. His wife Margaret had waited for him through 3 years of war. But the man who came home wasn't the man who'd left. He didn't talk about the war, didn't attend veteran reunions. When his son Robert Jr. asked about his service, Hayes would say only, "I did what I had to do." His daughter Sarah remembered asking her mother once why Daddy seemed so sad. Margaret just shook her head. "Something happened to him out there, but he won't talk about it." Margaret Hayes died in 1983. Lung cancer. Near the end, delirious from medication. She said something to Sarah. "I wish I knew what your father carries. I wish he could tell me." Robert Hayes sat beside her bed and said nothing. He had given his word to Naval Intelligence 50 years ago, and he would not break it, not even for her. In 1994, Dr. Sarah Chun, a military historian researching submarine warfare, opened a declassified file at the National Archives marked Operation Broken Anchor, November 1944. Inside were decoded Japanese messages, submarine positioning orders, and a name, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, USS Cunningham. She found Hayes in the San Diego phone book. Age 82, living near the naval base. When she called and mentioned Operation Broken Anchor, there was silence. Then Hayes asked, "Are you calling to tell me I can finally talk about it?" They met 2 days later. Dr. Chin brought the declassified files. Hayes brought 50 years of silence. They told me I could never explain, Hayes said, hands shaking as he held the documents. That lives depended on the secret. I gave my word. Dr. Chin told him the files were declassified. He could finally tell his story. Hayes was quiet for a long time. Then he said, 153 of my men died that night. The intelligence officers told me the operation saved 2 to 3,000 American lives. The submarines we eliminated, the convoys they would have attacked. But I knew the names of the 153 who died. I can still name them all. Every single one. Dr. Chin published her findings. The story made national news. Disgraced captain, actually war hero. Ensign Miller, now retired Captain Miller, read the article and called Hayes immediately, crying, "Skipper, I'm sorry. For 50 years, I thought..." Hayes' voice was gentle. "You had no way of knowing, Tom." That was the point. 12 other survivors reached out. Some apologized. Some just needed to hear his voice. On November 12, 1995, 51 years after the Cunningham sank, 8 survivors met at a VFW hall in San Diego. For the first time in 5 decades, they called Robert Hayes captain without doubt in their voices. Miller gave a speech. "We spent 50 years thinking our captain had failed us. Turns out he saved thousands of lives and never said a word. That's not failure. That's the definition of service." They saluted. Old men in their 70s and 80s, bodies worn but backs straight. Hayes saluted back. It was the first time in 50 years he'd felt like a captain again. Robert Hayes died on March 15, 1997, at the age of 85. 8 Cunningham survivors came to his funeral in uniform and saluted his casket. The Navy sent a letter to his children outlining Operation Broken Anchor. 8 submarines eliminated. Japanese surface force destroyed. An estimated 2,000 to 3,000 American lives saved. The letter ended. "Your father's sacrifice and silence exemplified the highest traditions of naval service." His son Robert Jr. said later, "I spent my whole childhood thinking my dad was ashamed of his service. Turns out, he was carrying a secret too important to share." Today, Robert Hayes' name appears in exactly 2 places: a footnote in a naval history book, and a memorial plaque at San Diego Naval Base. Most people will never know his story, but that's what we're here for, to remember the silent soldiers who couldn't speak. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more forgotten stories of real courage every week. Drop a comment. Tell us, could you carry a burden like this for 50 years? Let us know where you're watching from. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Robert Hayes was called a coward for 50 years, but he was something else entirely. He was a man who understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let the world think you're weak. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Robert Hayes doesn't disappear into silence.